Hi, I am Kaylee. I will be teaching a level 1 theater class on Shakespeare analysis, and the purpose of a director will be incorporated into this lesson. We're going to be discussing themes and things like that. My objectives are I can describe the major plot points that Shakespeare mentions in his prologue of Romeo and Juliet. I can discover the major themes in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet from the prologue, and I can interpret Shakespeare's language to find meaning. As everyone comes into class and the bell rings, I would start the class off with asking them who knows Romeo and Juliet. And from that point forward, we would all discuss together the beginning, the middle, and the end of Romeo and Juliet. And I'd write these up on the board so that everyone can see and we can all be on the same page. Then at that point, I would ask some volunteers to join me up at the front, and we were going to reenact Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in 60 seconds. So depending on the beginning, the middle, and the end we wrote, that amount of characters will come up and they will reenact it completely. After that 60-second reenactment, I'd ask them to sit down and explain to them that today we're going to be looking at the prologue of Romeo and Juliet, which is exactly what Shakespeare, the 60-second thing that we just did, is exactly what Shakespeare does in his 14-line prologue. So I would pass out the prologue and I would ask them to read this, but before they read it, and as they're reading it, I would ask them to mark up their text and to write symbols on it. For example, if they knew what Shakespeare was saying and the plot point that he's mentioning, they would write a check mark. If they didn't know it, they would write a plus sign. If they thought differently, they would write the squiggly line, and if they just found some confusing concepts or terms, I'd ask them to mark a question mark. I would ask them to do this in a distinct color that they would be able to quickly pick out. And I'd also ask them to highlight vocabulary terms that just seem a little bit funky. And give them time to read it. And then about 5 minutes maybe, I would take over the class again and do a dramatic reading myself. And as I do my reading, I want them to choose a very different, distinct color and do the same thing again while they listen to me. And maybe I could clarify some terms, so if I do, I'd ask them to take note of that as well. Two households, both alike in dignity, and fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventure piteous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which if you with patient ears could attend, what here shall miss our toil shall strive to mend. After I finished my reading, I would ask them briefly if this dramatic reading of it clarified any terms, if listening helped them understand just a little bit better than just reading themselves. Then I would mention how Shakespeare in this is just convoluted with a bunch of different themes he mentions. Then I'd ask them to choose 2 lines from their prologue that really drew an image for them. And I'd ask them on the back of their sheet to draw an image, just as I have. And I'd ask them to write the 2 lines that they chose at the bottom of their page. And then at the top of their page, I'd ask them to explain their image. For example, this is how I explained mine. This image to me, just like the lines from the prologue, says that their love is doomed. I show their death-marked love with a dagger in their heart and their parents' rage with fire at the base. I'd give them probably 10 to 12 minutes to draw the sketch. I'd explain that it doesn't have to be a beautiful sketch, it just has to be enough to show an image that they saw. So after they drew this, and they have everything written out, I'd ask them to turn to their neighbor, and I'd give them probably 5 to 7 minutes to discuss with their neighbor. And after we've discussed with our neighbors, we're going to bring it up to the class. And I'd ask the class for like 3 or 4 students to stand up and explain their images themselves. And then I'd mention how all of our images somehow relate to love, feud, and family. Interesting. What is that? And I'd explain that Shakespeare is very deliberate in his themes, even though they sometimes seem a little bit convoluted in his language. I'd encourage the students to look abstractly and to think outside the box as they read his language, because even though he is literal, he also is very colorful with his terms. And speaking of terms, I'd ask them at this point what terms were confusing in the prologue. What did they highlight during those first initial read-throughs? And at that point, we would spend as a class discussing these things and clarifying any of the terms. I would make it a discussion so that we could all figure it out together. Of course, it would be led by me so that we don't fall astray. Then, after we do this, I would explain to them that we were all just directors. We were all analyzing this prologue and discussing the themes of the prologue and finding the definitions of those terms that somewhat may seem confusing, which is the job of a director, to understand the script so well that if any actor has a question, they can help guide them to that. And if any production team member also has a question, they can guide them to the right answer so that everyone's on the same page and we're creating a beautiful conceptual show. At this point, I would ask them then to turn to the other side of their neighbor. And we're going to break down the prologue into rhyming couplets. They should know how to do this. However, if they don't, I can take time to clarify what I actually mean by this. Then, with each rhyming couplet group, I'd ask them to read together with their partner. And as they read, I'd ask them on a sticky note to write the questions that they may have, or the questions that it provokes, or an interesting thought that they thought of while reading this. Then after they finish that reading couplet, which is 4 lines typically in this, I'd ask them to discuss what they thought and what they have on their sticky notes. Then partner A, who's on the east side of the room, and partner B, who's on the west side of the room, partner A will write 1 to 2 sentences summarizing in contemporary language essentially what that little couplet means, while partner B writes in 1 to 2 words the theme of this couplet. Then they would move on to the next one. On a different sticky note, they would write questions, thoughts, interesting things that they think of while reading this. And then when they finish, partner B will be writing 1 to 2 sentences, and partner A will be writing 1 to 2 words that describe the theme. And they will continue to do this until they have finished. Once they have finished, we'll all come back together as a class, and I would ask them what they thought of this and what this prologue means to them, and I would help clarify any terms or concepts, and then I would explain that we're going to be starting a Romeo and Juliet unit. They would also be given a quiz where I basically asked them some basic plot points or some questions on themes and some vocabulary terms that were in this prologue. Yeah, their exit ticket for that day would be to turn in their papers so that I could have their images and their marked up prologue summaries and themes. Thank you for listening to my lesson.